Hello, lovely listeners, and welcome back to another episode of Even Tacos Fall Apart. I'm MommaFoxFire, and I am thrilled to have you here with us today. This podcast is all about diving into the messy, raw, and often unspoken aspects of life, especially when it comes to mental health, overcoming adversity, and embracing the challenges that make us all stronger. Even tacos do fall apart, and we still love them when they do that, and I still love you always. In today's episode, I am joined by a special guest who brings a wealth of expertise in the realm of social work, relationships, and mental health. Elaine, Belson, and I explore the intricate art of communication, uncover the hidden layers of understanding, and gain insights into fostering healthier connections, both with ourselves and the people around us. Elaine's approach to communication is unique and thought-provoking, and that really shines through in this episode. Instead of giving direct advice, she encourages the power of questions and self-discovery. It's a method that transcends mere conversation and dives into the heart of why we feel the way we do and how we can then navigate through our emotions to find solutions. We go into an exercise designed to enhance communication between partners, exploring empathetic listening and the art of delivering quote-unquote I messages. Our conversation goes beyond personal relationships, and we touch on the societal impact of mental health, breaking down common misconceptions and highlighting the importance of integrating mental health conversations into our daily lives. Stay tuned for a captivating discussion that uncovers how to honor our past while staying present, manage boundaries, and decide when a relationship might not be worth saving. Grab your favorite cup of tea, find a cozy spot, and let's embark on a journey of discovery, growth, and understanding. As we navigate through the intricacies of communication and mental health, remember that we are here to provide you with valuable insights, actionable advice, and heartfelt conversations. So let's dive in. There. It looks good to me. Hopefully it looks good to everyone else too. Hello. Welcome back to another Mental Health Monday. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for spending your evening with us. I'm really excited for our topic tonight. We're going to be talking about communication skills to save your relationships with our guest, Elaine Belson. So, Elaine, thank you so much for joining us here today. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much, Mom. It's wonderful to be here.
Absolutely. If you are here and you are here live with us today, we do have a question queue. If you have any questions, feel free to type ! the letter Q, follow it with your question. That'll be entered into a question queue, and we'll make sure to ask it. If you have any questions and you don't feel like going through the effort of typing those two characters, just put it into the chat and I'll get it. I'll pick it up for you. So it's all good. Whatever questions you have, feel free to ask. We will go through them. And yeah, thank you guys so much for being here today. I'm excited for this topic. So a little bit about Elaine. Elaine has 30 years combined clinical, military, political, and teaching experience. She has worked in a variety of settings, including private practice, community agencies, hospitals, and combat zones. At the age of 42, she joined the U.S. Army as a social work officer, handling domestic violence cases and running an anger management group for soldiers at Fort Bragg. She deployed to Afghanistan from 2009 to 2010, providing clinical services to soldiers and serving as executive officer for Medical Command. She served on the Safety Advisory Committee for Charles County Public Schools, Maryland Department of Social Services Board of Directors, and Civista?
Yes,
okay.
That's it, Civista.
All right, Civista Women's Center Diabetes Advisory Board. Elaine has also taught psychology at the college level and held several legislative positions in Washington, D.C. She's also had her own private practice since 2011, and she has a podcast and a blog called It's More Complicated Than You Think that looks at social issues through a psychological lens. She is developing a mental health curriculum pilot program for Charles County Public Schools, and I have lots of socials, websites, links, and everything. If you would like to connect with Elaine, please feel free to follow through any of these, and I'll put them into chat right now. And Elaine, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Happy to do it.
Absolutely. So we're gonna jump right in here. Why is effective communication crucial for maintaining healthy relationships?
Well, it's crucial not just for personal relationships, but for work relationships and society as a whole. In fact, we underestimate how important communication is. And part of the reason for that is because we really don't appreciate how complicated it is. So, I tell my patients that if it were easy, you would have figured it out already, right? So, give yourself some credit. But in fact, it's like learning a new language. And what happened with me is over the course of providing therapy and doing like presentations in work settings, and also working on the Hill and just observing, legislation and what's going on politically, because I am a political junkie, self-described. Um, what I've noticed is certain patterns in the way people communicate. And so one day I said, I'm going to write this down. And when I did, I discovered that there were 15 different, what I call principles of communication. And the reason I call them principles is because most of them are not really about technique. They are about understanding the way people relate to one another and also the way that we intrapsychically, the way we process our emotions, the way that we think, and the way that we manage our emotions. And so all of that, and problem solve. And so all of that plays a role. And that's why it's complicated. So, as we talk, I'm sure I'll give you some examples of some of these principles, and so you'll get a better appreciation for what I mean by that.
Yeah. So,
in fact, the first thing, every single couple, if you're out there and you're listening, and a couple, the first thing that every single couple tells me when they come into my office is we don't communicate. I call it the big C because it's the first thing that comes out of their mouth. Either we're coexisting or we're arguing all the time, right?
mm-hmm. Yeah, and communication, I mean, I can't stress enough how important it really is in everything. And like you said, it's not just romantic relationships. It's relationships with your mom, with your dad, with your sister, with your brother, with your coworkers, with your student's teacher, whatever those relationships are. So much could be solved, I think, if we all had better communication.
Right. And, one of the reasons I started my podcast was to also address it on a cultural level. Like, I mean, what's going on right now in the way that, we're, there's so much division and people are just arguing and pointing fingers and criticizing. All of that is communication as well. And if you know how to get to the underlying dynamic, you can really avoid power struggles and really get to the bottom of what's causing these divisions.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
I'm sure I'll get a chance to give you some examples.
Yeah. What are some of the most common communication challenges that couples or individuals face in their relationships?
Well, one of them is what I call perception and intent. So I say there's perception and intent, and both are important. Neither one is, there's not about right and wrong, right? It's about perception and intent. So what do I mean by that? I'll give you a simple example. So let's say I have a couple where, let's say the wife is talking to her husband and he doesn't answer, right? And so what does she do? She says, "Why are you ignoring me?" And what he's going to say is, "I'm not ignoring you. I'm just tired or I'm distracted," right? This actually was an actual argument that came up with a couple I was working with where he was tired. I think he was falling asleep or he had been sleeping and she didn't realize. But this was an ongoing theme where she felt ignored, right? And so because perception intent is about I know how I felt, And then the other person's like, well, I know what my intentions were, right? And so it's not about right and wrong, it's about validating both, right? And so she has a right to feel ignored because that was the impact that his behavior had on her, right? And so rather than trying to talk her out of those feelings, right, we want to understand, okay, what was I doing, right, that was making you feel that way, even though I know that that wasn't my intent, that wasn't what I was doing, right? But if we're going to move forward, we have to understand the impact that our behavior is having on the other person. And one of the things that I tell people is that you can understand something and still have feelings about it. And that's what's really important here, right? It's not about right and wrong. It's about honoring the fact that, okay, my behavior had this impact on you. It's made you feel this way. And there could be, other reasons why. I mean, that have nothing to do with that present moment. It could be, something that was triggered from the past, either in the relationship or, something that's happened to that person in the past. So this is what happens, okay? People say, "Well, that's not what I was doing. I wasn't ignoring you. I was just tired, And what that person, the other person's going to hear is, "You're wrong for the way that you feel, and here's this really good reason why." And so, no matter what it is, I'm telling you, this is human nature. If you try to argue with the person because you think, oh, I'm going to explain that that was not my intent, that's not what I was doing. And once that person understands that, they're going to feel better. Nope.
Yeah.
Nope. That is not what happens because, and again, this is why my podcast is called It's More Complicated Than You Think, is because people, most of the time, they're motivated by emotion, but they don't speak in terms of feelings, right? They don't say, what you just said, or you're not responding to me, that makes me feel like you're not really interested in what I have to say, or that I'm not that important to you, or I feel ignored, right? People don't communicate in terms of feelings, even though I know it sounds kind of robotic and it might sound kind of a little bit, it sounds a little bit like put upon, but it's actually, once you get into the habit of it, you appreciate it's absolutely crucial, right? Because in reality, that is what's happening. And we live in a culture where, because we don't value feelings and we don't recognize their value, and we tend to minimize them and talk ourselves out of them or analyze them. So we don't learn how to speak in terms of emotions, but we are acting on them. So when somebody says, "Why are you ignoring me?" what they're really saying is, "I feel hurt," right? Or "I feel uncared about." And unfortunately, because people don't communicate in those terms, the other person doesn't hear that. And so they think, "Well, I'm not ignoring you," right? And becomes this cerebral sort of argument, as opposed to really a conversation about feelings. So the person, though, on the other end of that has good intentions. And 9 times out of 10, that is the case, right? So what happens is we know how we feel, right? But too often what happens is people make assumptions like, "Well, I feel ignored, so that was your intent."
Right.
Right. And when we talk about techniques, I can go into that a little bit more. But the reality is that most of the time, the way that you are receiving something and the way that it makes you feel is not the way the person intends it to come across. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's what I mean by perception and intent. The person has good intentions, and that doesn't make them right and you wrong. But on the other hand, because you feel a certain way, that doesn't make you right and them wrong. And so the whole idea is to understand both of those. If I keep in mind how I'm coming across, and you keep in mind that, I usually have good intentions and you don't make assumptions, that's how you avoid those kinds of, those kinds of arguments.
Right.
See, it's simple, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. Totally easy.
Human beings are far more complicated than they give themselves credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and in that scenario also, you come in and your partner is falling asleep. First of all, you're catching them at a moment where they're not ready for any sort of serious communication. And so you haven't communicated that you want to have a serious conversation. You're just jumping right in. The other person is not responding. They're not intending to hurt your feelings. But then you saying, like, you're ignoring me puts them immediately into a defensive position. And then they're trying to explain things, and it's only making it's just like the whole thing comes back to like
exactly.
the original moment of when that communication could have started differently.
Right. Exactly. And yet that simple little exchange, right? See how complicated that simple little exchange is. Yep. And it happens all the time, day in and day out. It's so easy to fall into it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what are some of the communication skills that can make or break your relationships?
Okay, so since we were just talking about perception and intent, I actually do have just 2 skills really in my 15 principles that really are techniques, but they're very useful ones. So let's go back to this scenario, right? So people who've done any kind of couples counseling have probably heard of iMessaging, right? And so basically the classic structure of iMessaging is you start out with, when you do X, and X is either going to be something that the person said or did, but it has to be something that is concrete, observable, right? So when you didn't answer me when I was talking to you, right? But what often happens is people characterize it. They say, well, you ignored me. Well, I didn't ignore you. I wasn't ignoring you, right? So that's why iMessaging can be so valuable, because the first thing that you want to do is you want to stick to something concrete. When you walked away from me, when you said, well, what do you want me to do about it? Whatever it is, right? And then the second thing is using a feeling adjective, right? I felt ignored. So when you didn't answer me, I felt ignored, right? Or I felt dismissed, or I felt hurt, right? And so you want to use a feeling label, right? And this is again where people get stuck, is they'll think they're doing iMessaging because they start out with I.
Right.
I felt like you were being a jerk.
Yeah.
Right? I felt like, you don't really care about me, right? And so, yeah, well, you started out good with the I, but then you turned it around and you said you, and you characterized the person's behavior. And so that's why, think feeling label, have a little feeling list if you want. I mean, I actually do. I have feeling lists that I give to some of my couples if they need them. And then, so the third part usually in a classic iMessaging is, and then I respond to that by, and then it's about explaining what the person does as a result of how they felt. So when you didn't respond to me, I felt ignored, and I responded to that by storming out of the room and slamming the door, right? So what I've done is I've made my own little variation on iMessaging. And so instead of adding that third part, what I say is, but I don't want to make any assumptions. So I'm checking in with you. Is that how you meant to come across, or is that how you feel? So when you didn't respond to me, I felt ignored, but I don't want to make any assumptions. So I'm checking in with you first. Is that what you meant to do? Is that how you meant to come across? Or, depending on what the scenario is, sometimes it might be, is that actually how you feel? Like, I felt like you don't care about me. Is that how you really feel?
Mm-hmm.
And again, 9 times out of 10, the person's going to, no. That isn't how I felt, or that isn't my intent. And so what it does is it accomplishes a couple of things. Because you were talking about this earlier, about immediately what's going to happen is the person's going to feel put on the defensive, right? And so what we're doing is we are heading that off at the pass, right? We're going to address that before that person even has a chance to feel put on the defensive, because we're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, right? And we're going to say, you know what? I'm going to guess that you had good intentions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to check in with you first, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to explain yourself, right? And so you avoid, that.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, you're also asserting yourself. You're not bottling up your feelings. You're not telling yourself, oh, I shouldn't be bothered by this, or I don't have a right to feel this way. You're still asserting your feelings at the same time. And so you're accomplishing both things, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So that's I messaging. Now, let's just say, for the sake of argument, right, that I don't use my I messaging that I've learned, right? And so I still say to you, Mama, I don't appreciate you ignoring me, right? So what you can still do, right? Because no matter what I do, you're still responsible for how you respond.
That's right.
That's one of my other principles, right? But you can use what's called empathic listening. And you can say, okay, so, I know in my head that I wasn't ignoring her. I don't agree with that. But let me try to get more information, right? So you would say, okay, Elaine, well, what is it that I was doing or saying that gave you the impression I was ignoring you? And so what I try to press upon people is that empathy is not a weakness. It's not saying you agree. It is a tool. The way I like to put it is, for some of you who may be older like me, who may be familiar with a detective show back in the 70s called Columbo. So Columbo was this detective. He used to walk around in this wrinkled trench coat, and he would act like, I'm not sure,
One more question.
Dumb, right? One more question. You know him. Yes. So what I call it is be Columbo without the trench coat and the cigar. Basically, just gather more information, even though you don't agree, right?
Yeah.
You don't have to agree. Empathy is not about agreeing. It's about wanting to understand where the other person's coming from, even though you don't agree. And why? Because, again, I'm a pragmatist, a social worker. I'm a pragmatist. I want to do what works, and that's what's effective. And these are the kinds of skills that, I would teach soldiers. I mean, I work with soldiers who were referred to anger management groups because they were involved in domestic violence disputes. And so, this is about learning about what works.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the two techniques, empathic listening and I-messaging.
Yeah. And those are two things that I really want to stress. Like, the I-messaging is great if you do it right. It's so easy to slip back in, but you have to give yourself, I say, the grace and the space to do it again later. If you mess it up, just go back and you can do it again. Just because it didn't work one time doesn't mean that it's not going to work the next time. And I really...
And understand that this is a learning curve.
Yes. Yeah, it's a new skill. Just like if you're trying to learn... Okay, so my kids just started, as if they needed more activities. They just started violin lessons and guitar lessons. And so treat it like you're learning to play the violin or the guitar. It's a new skill that you have to practice. It's a new skill that you have to learn more things about later after you figure out. Step 1 is learning to use iMessaging. Maybe step 2 is putting a little empathy behind it. All of these communication skills, like, you have to treat them really like they are a new skill. And so many people just think, okay, my therapist told me to do it this way, I'm going to do it this way, and that there's no learning involved when there really, really is a lot of learning that goes into a
Absolutely,
lot of
absolutely. And
this.
I can vouch for that because, working with couples, they'll come back and, oftentimes say, oh, it didn't work. And, and then I'll go, okay, well, let's go over what did you do?
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say, oh, I didn't do it right. And it's like, okay, don't look at it as right and wrong. Look at it as, what works, what doesn't work. And, again, that's okay. If you heard that, that was the kitten.
Oh, is the kitten okay?
We have a 3-month-old kitten that just got on a shelf and knocked over a bunch of books. Okay. So
it happens.
But anyway,
it happens.
That's why I say it's like learning a new language, because we know how hard it is to learn a new language.
Mm-hmm.
And the other thing that's really important is I really encourage people to use it in the moment. That's when it's most effective, right? Is, when something is going on in the moment, that's the best time to say, hey, what you just said or did, it made me feel this way, but I'm checking in with you, that sort of thing. So that's when it's most useful, is when you can use it in the moment while things are happening.
Yeah. I would love to go back to your Columbo example, because that ties in perfectly to what I want to ask next. Because Columbo, one thing about Columbo is that you're sitting there and you're watching the show. My grandparents loved like crime shows, court shows. They watched Matlock, they watched Murder, She Wrote, like all of those things. And so I grew up watching them. And I loved them. And you would be sitting there and you'd be watching Columbo, or you'd be watching Matlock, or you'd be watching, actually any of those ones that I just listed. But you brought up Columbo specifically. So you're watching Columbo. He goes through all of his investigation stuff. Now he's in court and he's asking all of these questions that don't seem like they're going to be a gotcha question. And then all of a sudden at the end, he turns around and asks his one more question. And so what he's done with all of that gathering info at the very beginning is he was listening to try to figure something out. So not that it does not have to stay on the theme of Columbo, but do you have any practical tips for becoming a better listener?
So what I say is the most important principle of the 15 is wanting to understand where the other person is coming from, right? And so, and I learned this the hard way from being in a relationship where I didn't feel heard, but it's one of these things where, and especially I think women, it's like, well, maybe if I say it this way, or maybe if I wait until this moment, or, maybe if I, if I say it louder or more frequently or whatever, right? What am I doing wrong, so to speak? So this is what I mean by that. The other person has to meet you halfway, at least halfway, right? So if you find yourself in a situation where you're trying to get the other person to understand where you're coming from, right? You're doing too much work. They should want to understand. So they should be wanting to ask questions, right? So I'm not understanding. So help me to understand. What do you mean by this? Help me to, what was it about this thing that I did or said that bothered you, right? And so if you're getting louder or you're repeating yourself, or the other person just keeps, getting on the defensive and challenging you, right? Then something is wrong. They're not listening. In other words, you should not be doing most of the work, right? They should be making an effort to want to understand what it is that you're trying to tell them. And I'll bet there's a lot of people out there listening who are going, yep, I know exactly what you mean, right? And again, having said that, I always tell couples that 80% of the time, the things that we attribute to a personality flaw, right, person's controlling or they're insensitive, or they're selfish, is actually miscommunication, right? But it's a win-win situation, because if you go into it and you're either going to improve, your relationship's going to improve as you learn, how to communicate, or you're going to realize, okay, this person is not able, they're not flexible enough, their personality is not flexible enough, they're not able to adjust and change, and you're better off knowing that now, right, before you continue to stay in a relationship where the person isn't capable of meeting you halfway. So, but the good news is that most of the time, the things that we attribute to somebody not caring or not, wanting to not wanting to work with us or understand is miscommunication. And so I always give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah. And it goes back to what you were saying earlier of just like ask for that clarification. Say, was that your intent? And give them a chance to explain it. And listen when they explain it. And them explaining why they said something or did something one way does not excuse anything. It doesn't mean you can't feel whatever way you're feeling about it. It just means that you're trying to open up and A, let them know how you're feeling, and then B, trying to figure out why they did or said or whatever it was.
Right. You remember earlier we talked about feelings, right? People are mostly motivated by emotion, even though they don't express in those terms. So one of the things that happens commonly is people get triggered. Okay, so let me share this analogy. So if I take a pitcher, okay, and I pour in coffee and then soda and then orange juice, right? What's going to happen? Yummy, right?
I went from happy with coffee to just very upset.
There's a method to my madness.
I understand.
So you want the coffee, Mama, but you don't want the orange juice and soda, right? Well, what's going to happen when you go to pour out the coffee? The orange juice and the soda are going to come with it.
Yeah.
So that's what happens with emotions, right? And so, again, I feel ignored because you didn't respond to me. And maybe I grew up in a household where I felt ignored. Actually, my brother and my sister were 7 and 11 years older than me. And so I can remember sitting around the dinner table trying to get a word in edgewise, but because my brother and my sister were older and so much more articulate, I could just remember this little girl, just sort of sitting there. And so, I could say, not consciously necessarily, but you ignoring me could trigger that feeling of feeling ignored as a child. And so what happens is I might find myself being really hurt or really offended or really angry because you're ignoring me, and you're like, whoa, 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 what's going on here? What's going on is that the orange juice and the soda are coming out with the coffee, right? And so that's just human nature. We all have triggers. And so the answer is not to go, well, Elaine, that's your problem. I'm not your family. I'm not your brother and your sister. I'm not your parents sitting around the dinner table. So that's your issue, right? If you're in a relationship with somebody, and I like to say, love me, love my triggers, right? Or, really it's about, I always say that the only people that matter in a relationship are the two people that are in it, right? So it doesn't matter what Sally and Joe do, right? You're in a relationship with, you and I are in a friendship, right? You're in a relationship with me. And so, if you're a good friend, then you understand that, I have triggers. We all have triggers. but what often happens is people find themselves like, wow, why am I so angry in this moment, right? And so that's what happens is you're not just responding to what's happening in the here and now. You are also responding to that history. And it could be history in the relationship, if there's a pattern in the relationship, or it could be, or it could be something from your upbringing. Mm-hmm. So the tricky part here is ideally, what I try to do is to help people to be aware of their triggers so that I can say, you know what, Mama, I'm aware that right now I am feeling really hurt because you didn't respond to me, because I feel ignored. But I'm aware that that's not just coming from this moment. I'm reminded when you didn't respond to me, it reminded me of sitting around the dinner table at the age of 5 or 6, right? And so that's what, it's important about understanding that we all have triggers. And that's okay because that's part of being human. So we are supportive or understanding of that, right? But if on the receiving end you're like, whoa, this person seems like they're more upset than what it seems would be called for in this situation. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if there's something more going on.
Yeah.
Right. And if it is somebody that you're in a relationship with, you can say, hey, it sounds like you're really, really, upset right now. And I'm wondering, what's going on? We just check in with that person, right? And, help me to understand. And so together you can work on that. Is it something that I need to resolve? Do I need to talk to somebody on my own about, my unresolved feelings about my childhood? Or is it something that, okay, I'm glad that I know now that that's something that is an issue, and I'll keep that in mind for the future.
Yeah.
So that's how you work through those things. But again, we all have to appreciate that as human beings, we all have triggers, and to be understanding of that.
Yeah. And just knowing that someone has a certain trigger doesn't mean that you're always going to be able to avoid it either. But understanding
Absolutely.
it, if I understand, all right, Elaine, you grew up this way. I'm going to do my best not to have that come into our relationship. However, there may be a time where I've got an emergency and I can't respond to you because I got to respond to my kids. Like, all right. So, but then what you can do as an active listener, so you've heard what Elaine has to say. There was a situation that came up. You probably know that it's going to trigger something in them. That check-in is so important to say, look, I know that you probably, are feeling a sort of way. I just want to check in with you and let you know, here's what happened with me, but how are you feeling and what can I do right now for you? So right. the check-in and the follow-up is really important.
Yes. And again, if you're in a relationship with somebody and this becomes a repeat issue, well, then it's like, I think maybe, you need to take care of your feelings. If this is something that's really, affecting you, then it sounds like you owe it to yourself to resolve those feelings, maybe in therapy. But another one of my principles is no matter how much somebody angers you, frustrates you, hurts you, irritates you, whatever it is, you're still responsible for how you manage your emotions and how you express them, right? And that's really important, particularly, I think, if you're in a relationship where somebody is, verbally, emotionally, or even physically abusive, right? You're not responsible for the way that person regulates their feelings and expresses them, communicates them. That's on them, no matter what you do. And so we really need to understand that, because that way we each take responsibility, right? So even though you may have triggered me and I know I have my triggers, I'm still ultimately responsible for how I react to being triggered. And it's a process, right? and learning from that. But ultimately, it's so important for people because especially in the climate that we're living in right now, if each person were to say to themselves, what can I do differently? What's in my control to change how I communicate, right? Or how I manage my emotions, rather than pointing to the other person and saying, this is what you need to do differently. This is what you need to fix. Because we have an expression in my field, if you drop a pebble into water, it causes ripples, right? So change what you do and it changes what other people do around you. And that's part of the problem is everybody keeps reacting, in anger or in fear. And so it just keeps feeding that, right? But if we all take responsibility, and when I work with people, that's what I do. I tell them, I say, okay, instead of, like if I'm working with two siblings, right? I remember working with this 9-year-old, and she was like a 40-year-old in a 9-year-old body, and so she knew how to trigger her older brother. She was really good at that. And so, but what I would do is because they would come in and they would be, blaming each other and complaining about each other, and I said, okay, what is it that each of you can do? Look windward and ask yourself, what can I do differently to avoid this pattern that we keep running into?
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely know how to trigger my sisters if I wanted to. I do actively try not to now as a mature adult. But boy, when I was a kid, I definitely did some digging in there. They did too. Like I wasn't the only one. But
right. What's the age difference between you and your siblings?
So I am 2 years apart from one sister, and I am 7 years apart from the other. So the one that I'm 2 years apart is actually here in chat tonight. Hi, Bite Mark. I love you, and I'm sorry. And she says I just tried to trigger the singing these days.
I was lucky because I was so much younger than my brother and my sister that I kind of stayed been under the fray, right? So there was more sibling rivalry between the two of them, right? And I was the baby. So
yeah. Oh yeah, I think
spoiled everybody knows.
Bite can disagree or not, but I feel like there was much more sibling rivalry between myself and her than there was between her and our baby sister or me and our baby sister. Like that was just It was just the distance was enough, and also we had each other to fight with.
Right.
So yeah, but I mean, going back to what you said about you're only responsible for your actions and reactions. That's all you can be responsible for. You're not even responsible. Now I'm going to say this, and some people might disagree, but you're not even responsible for your children's actions and reactions. What you are responsible for with children is teaching them the skills and teaching them how it's okay to act and react and how it's not okay to act and react. But their actions and reactions are truly their responsibility, not yours. Same with everyone else in the whole world.
Right. I actually, on my podcast, I have 3 episodes that I did on parenting because I also work with kids. I do child therapy. And so there's a lot of really good stuff in that. Each one is an hour long. So highly recommend listening to those.
Absolutely. What role does nonverbal communication play in relationships? We've talked about verbal communication, emotions, reactions, but how can people become more aware of their nonverbal cues?
So, I think that is a really interesting question. I think that the best way of, I think a lot of times we don't necessarily appreciate or understand our own nonverbals, right? And so I think in that regard, I think it's more about being open to feedback from the other person, right? And again, that feedback should be constructive. So this kind of gets a little bit away from communication and into something else, but it it's part of why people react the way that they do. So one of the things that happens is when people are growing up, right? The role of a parent is to be what we call a mirroring object, right? And so how a child gets a sense of self is very much dependent upon how their parent reacts to them.
Mm-hmm.
And so if a child comes running home and says, "Mommy, I fell off my bike," and mom says, "Well, you should be more careful next time," right? Not earth-shatteringly inappropriate, but compare that to, "Well, that's okay. I know you're a great bike rider and you'll get right back on and you'll do great," right? And you can see what the different messages they send. Well, since a lot of us, most of us, I would say, grow up in dysfunctional families, and we don't teach parents about these concepts like mirroring. Most people grow up with either inconsistent mirroring or negative mirroring. And so what happens is when they go out into the world, they keep using people as mirrors. They use other people as mirrors. And most people do this, whether they're conscious of it or not. They're using other people as mirrors, right? And the problem with that, the risk with that is that, like I said earlier, most people don't know how to manage their emotions and express them.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're using somebody else as a mirror for a sense of self and self-worth or a sense of competence, what you're doing is you are basing that on dysfunctional coping and dysfunctional communication skills.
Mm-hmm.
So what I tell people is never use other people as mirrors for a sense of self, right, and self-worth. Now that's different from feedback. People can give you feedback about your behavior, but it should never be about who you are as a person and your worth as a person. You decide that. But again, because most people don't learn how to give constructive feedback and they don't speak in terms of, in terms of constructive, giving, in terms of feelings, right? So they'll say things like, "Oh, well, why are you being such a jerk?" Or, why are you being, again, why are you ignoring me, right? And so immediately, if you're already treating people as mirrors, then that's going to affect how you feel about yourself. Oh my God, what am I doing wrong? I'm a bad person, right? And so when we get to this whole idea about feedback, we have to be really careful about whatever feedback we get from other people to not let it affect how we feel about ourselves in terms of, our self-worth, our competence, who we are as people, right? And so what I teach people is self-validation, right? And so there's two techniques, and one of them is called what I call be your own best friend. So one of the things that I love, I always say people, I like to use their kids against them, right? Because so what happens is most people, this is almost universal, walk around with feelings of inadequacy. I'm not good enough. I'm not deserving enough. There's something inherently wrong with me. And so what do? Is they're using other people as mirrors to overcompensate for that. And so what do people do? They mind read, they second guess themselves, they compare themselves to others, they anticipate other people's reactions, and they self-criticize. Basically, they bully themselves or they ruminate that inner negative dialogue, right? And so what happens is they use those techniques because I am dependent on how other people react to me. I'm using them as mirrors. And so if somebody responds to me in a way that is negative, well, then it's not just, oh, I've disappointed that person or hurt that person's feelings. It's I'm a bad person, right? Because I'm using that person as a mirror for a sense of self, right? And so So that's where the risks come in. And so, but if you were talking to one of your children, you would never say to them, now, Junior, if you want to avoid rejection and failure, right? If you want to avoid feelings of inadequacy, this is what you do. You need to mind read. You need to second guess yourself. You need to anticipate other people's reactions. You need to compare yourself to others, and you need to self criticize, right? We would never say that to somebody we care about. And yet people do this unconsciously. Again, why? Because they're afraid. If I stop bullying myself, if I stop overcompensating and doing these things, I will surely be rejected. I will surely fail, right? And fear of failure and rejection are normal. Those are innate fears that we have. And so instead, what I teach people is this is where be your own best friend comes in, right? If one of your children came to you and said, oh, I did really bad on this test, I'm so stupid, what do we usually say when we're talking to somebody we care about? Just be yourself. Don't worry about what other people think, right? Don't be so hard on yourself. Don't call yourself names, right? And so anytime you catch yourself saying anything negative like that, doing any of those 5 things that I described, right? What you want to do is you want to ask yourself, any of these things that I'm doing to myself, would I say that to somebody that I care about? Would I say that to one of my children? Oh, that was stupid, right? Right? Or why did you do that? You should have, you should have known better, right? Oh, well, I'm sure Sally doesn't act that way, right? All of these things that we do to ourselves, the comparing, the name calling, right? And the second guessing, etc., right? So imagine whatever you're saying to yourself that's negative, saying it to your children or to somebody that you care about. And I do this all the time. And the answer is always, oh, I would never do that.
Yeah,
oh, really?
exactly.
Well, that's interesting. Why not? Oh, well, because it's mean. Huh, you don't say. Right? Well, but don't you want that your child to avoid rejection and failure? Yes, but that's not the way to do it. Bingo. Yeah. Exactly. We recognize that. That isn't the way to avoid rejection or failure. What would we do instead? What would we say to that person? Well, let's look at you did badly on this exam? Okay. Let's go over it. Let's try to figure out, what you can learn from it, what you need to do differently, whatever it is, right? We problem solve. So again, being your own best friend is about imagining what wouldn't I say to somebody I care about? And then what would I say? And whatever it is you would say, that's what you should be saying to yourself.
Yeah.
Right? And again, why? Because even though it's scary to let go of the bully, intellectually that that's not the way to avoid rejection and failure. That's not the way to cope with those feelings of inadequacy. And so it's about, I call it the buy-in, basically. It's about understanding intellectually that it's okay to that you don't need to beat yourself up or second guess or do any of those things, right, as a way of avoiding rejection or failure. And so this is about tapping into your values, that is the way you treat other people, to treat yourself. And the thing is, when we're talking to other people, we're operating from a place of values and from a place of reason. But when we're talking to ourselves, we're usually talking from a place of insecurity and fear. So that's why it sounds different. So that's what I call be your own best friend. Second type of self-validating is so the first one is when you're being hard on yourself, when you're treating yourself badly. Now, in terms of relationships and communication, anytime somebody else is making you feel bad about yourself, that's when you can apply what I call the opposite of the golden rule. So we all know what the golden rule is, right? Do unto others as you would have done to you, right? So this is the opposite of the golden rule is you have a right to be treated the way you treat other people. So anytime somebody else makes you feel bad about yourself as a person, ask yourself, if the situation reversed, would I respond the way this person's responding? Would I talk to them the way they're talking to me? And this is actually where this got started, was when I was working with kids and helping them to cope with bullying.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, if the situation reversed, would you talk to, that person, that student, that kid, the way they're, oh no, I would never talk to them that way. Really? Huh. Well, that's interesting. And so what I'm getting that person to do, that child, is to look at that other child's behavior objectively and critically, right? As opposed to internalizing the way that they're being treated. It's about looking at, well, this is the way that it's not about the content. There's always a constructive way to give feedback.
Mm-hmm.
What we're responding to is the way that that person is treating you. Most of the time, when somebody else makes us feel bad, it's not about the content. It's about the way that they are treating you, if that makes sense. So that's what I call the opposite of the golden rule.
Yeah, and I think that that's great. It's a way to say, like, do I deserve to be treated this way? And the way that you determine that is, would I treat someone else in the same situation that way? And I think, especially in the case of a relationship that isn't healthy, the answer is going to be no. And that's a really good indicator of, it's kind of that litmus test, right? To say, like, is this healthy? Would I treat them this way? That kind of thing. And then it can be a good discussion. If it is a healthy relationship and you can have a good discussion, then that's great. So how can individuals overcome some of these communication barriers, especially if they're going to deal with something that's kind of a difficult topic or sensitive issue? How can they overcome some of those barriers?
So what do you mean by barriers?
Well, so let's say that it's a nonverbal issue that they're having, where it's someone who's giving off just bad vibes in a situation, or if it's a verbal barrier, it's just they're not communicating on the same level. They're not talking about the same things in the same ways. Maybe one person is using iMessaging and the other is just tromping all over and not using it. How do you overcome those, especially with something that could be a difficult conversation?
Right. Well, I think the thing to always do is people are much more less defensive and more open when you talk in terms of feelings. And so if I see somebody is exuding a certain kind of behavior, what I would probably do is check in with them and say, you seem really frustrated right now, or you seem really angry, right? And and the person might say, no, I'm not angry. I mean, I've actually had that happen to me. I'm not angry. I'm like, okay, it's not going to work with everybody, but at least you are diffusing the situation by not responding on, on a what I call the content level, by saying, whatever it is that they're saying to you, if you just respond to that content, right? I'll give you an example. I was in a workshop, and I was asking a question. It was actually a political workshop, and so this was right after the 2022 election, and the speaker was someone who was running for office. He was an incumbent, and he lost his election. And so I tried to be, very polite. And so, being in this field as long as I have, I didn't say to him, well, why did you lose? Right? Or what did you do wrong? I said, well, what do you think got in the way, right, of your, of your winning, right? And so, he explained, what he thought, was going on. And then I was asking him some questions about how to engage voters. Uh, because as a someone in behavioral health, I look at people's behavior and why culturally why people don't like getting more engaged in civic activism, whatnot, right? So I was kind of exploring that with him, and so, and I was kind of discussing it with him and giving him some of my impressions about, communication skills and what I learned about what works and doesn't work. And he, was just very cynical. And I didn't say he was cynical, but that was his feeling about it was that, I don't think there's anything you can really do about it. So after, he left, one of the other members of the group just started lashing out at me and telling me that I was really rude and that she said something about I'm always using big words, like I guess kind of insinuating that I think I'm better than everybody else. I'm not sure, something along those lines. And she was somebody that was an angry person. I mean, I had seen her do this to other folks in the workshop, particularly the person who was the leader, right? And so anyway, I said to her, I said, "You sound really angry." And she goes, "I'm not angry, and don't psychoanalyze me or something along those." She goes, "My husband's in counseling too." And I'm like, "Okay, you know." And so I just offered, I'll stick around after, the workshop is over. If you want to talk, I'm more than happy to talk with you. And so I did, and she did stick around, but only to tell the speaker, or not the speaker, the class, the leader, the workshop leader, that she was sorry, that and she was saying, I'm just gonna sit back. I'm not gonna say anything anymore, and whatnot. And so I thought about it, and I wrote her this email, um, and um, and basically in it, I said to her, I commended her for speaking up, because I said a lot of women don't speak up for themselves,
Right.
even though I think the way that she went about it was not, again, opposite of the golden rule.
Right.
It's not the way I would have handled it, right? And that gave me some perspective, because I thought to myself, if I were in that situation where I felt like somebody else was insulting a speaker or, acting like she knew better than everybody else and any of those things, I certainly would not have expressed it the way that she did. And that really helped to give me some perspective, because I know, particularly with women, anytime we're very relationship oriented, and so anytime somebody's upset with us, our first reaction is like, "Oh, what did I do wrong?" Right? But I also said to her, I said, "I hope that you won't, that you will continue to participate. Um, but if you don't, that's your choice, right? In other words, don't blame other people because you're choosing, suddenly to not participate."
Right.
I didn't say it that way, but basically, again, you're responsible for how you cope with your feelings and how you express them. Um, and one of the other things that I also said to her is I explained to her about what I call embracing our humanity. And this is a really important piece in terms of self-validation. It goes along with self-validation. It's about understanding that, we're going to give up all of these different ruminating, this old rumination. We're going to give it up and say to ourselves, you know what? I'm okay the way that I am. I don't need to constantly be on myself, second guessing, analyzing, mind reading. I don't need to do all of those things. that doesn't mean that I'm not going to make mistakes. It doesn't mean I'm not going to fall flat on my face and piss somebody off like I did in that workshop, right? It doesn't mean that I'm not going to hurt people's feelings. I'm not going to annoy people. Um, it doesn't mean that I'm not going to make mistakes. This is about what I call embracing human error. It's about forgiving yourself for being human, because we all are. And one of the problems in our culture, particularly in the age of social media, is that we've gotten to a point where anytime somebody, steps in it, right, says something that offends people, we miss opportunities. We could, again, going back to communication, we could use those opportunities for people to have constructive conversations about, help me to understand what about what you said, uh, offended, that was offensive. And in turn, you know, help me to understand what you meant. What was your intent? Because to me, as long as the person has good intentions, there's not like in the case of what, my example, I didn't have malicious intent, right? And that was one of the things that I said in my email to this person is, as long as the person doesn't have malicious intent, I try to give them the benefit of the doubt. And so the problem is that we have come so quick to judge people that we send a message that human error is abnormal, when in reality, our cultural expectations are unrealistic.
Yeah.
Right?
That's one of those things.
And this has become such a huge problem.
I feel like everyone publicly, especially like you said, age of social media, everyone publicly puts forward that they're perfect. And it's one of those things that no one is perfect. Everyone has done something to fuck up. Everyone has done something embarrassing. Everyone has done something weird that they don't want to admit. Like all of these, every single person, I don't care if they admit it or not, if they're an adult, they've had enough time to screw up in their lives. and they
exactly.
have at least
don't
once.
Go through this life without regrets.
No matter if you're a golden child, it doesn't matter. By the time you're an adult, you've done something stupid at least once. Right. So if we're all saying like everyone's perfect, everything is perfect, everything has to be perfect, that's unrealistic. And then also you just have to understand that you got to give people a chance to not be perfect. Because if you're expecting perfection all the time, you're going to be just disappointed in life on the whole.
Absolutely. And again, going back to my blog, in this case, I have a blog, and one of the articles in there is about embracing your humanity, where, I pull from some current events, things that celebrities have done, to step in it, and the groundswell, of opposition, that these people run into. Never mind, all of the wonderful things that they might have done leading up to that.
Yeah.
And so, but again, it's not to say that those things aren't relevant and that people don't have a right to be offended or hurt or angry or whatever, but it's about how we go about it. And when we shame and blame and criticize and cancel each other out, then we're missing opportunities to actually demonstrate, how we can communicate constructively and work through our differences and our misunderstandings. And that's what I feel is the tragedy of it all. And the other thing too, when we talk about, like you're saying, when we don't accept that we're all going to fuck up, as you say, it creates this feeling of isolation.
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many people come to me and say, oh, I'm really hard on myself. And I'm like, oh, no, really? I'm like, you and just about everybody else on the planet. I mean, that's what I want people to understand, is that everything that you think you're doing that's unique to you, right? That all of these things that you do wrong, it's just common. It's just everybody does them. Everybody has, those feelings of insecurity. Everybody's hard on themselves, and so it creates this feeling of isolation, like I'm the only one. There's something wrong with me.
Yeah.
And that is really dangerous.
Absolutely.
Because then people feel like, that's when they get depressed and they can become, suicidal. And so, that's the other thing that I, by explaining to people, you're more complicated than you think you are. And that you're not alone. Everything that you think is unique to you. I'm sorry, you're not that special.
Right.
In the sense that, everything that you think you're doing wrong, you're not.
The human experience.
These are just normal human, right? Your normal human nature.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a question in the chat that I want to make sure that we get to.
Oh, goody.
So is there a nice way to tell someone they need to work their own shit out, probably in therapy? Because I feel like saying that's not a me problem, that's a you problem, probably isn't it. So is there a nice way to tell somebody to go seek professional help?
Right. Well, first of all, let me say this. Everybody needs therapy at some point in their life, right? Just like everybody needs to go to the doctor at some point, right? This is, again, a byproduct of our misunderstanding about mental health and the stigma attached to it. Most of the work that I do is the kind of stuff that I'm discussing with you now. It's about, self-esteem, managing anxiety, communication, parenting, just normal, everyday functioning. And, you would never say, I'm never going to a doctor. If somebody said, I'm never going to a doctor ever in my entire life, you would think that's irrational.
Right.
But yet that's the way people look at, therapy. But the way we should look at it is the same way we look at going to a doctor. I'm having this issue at work, or I'm having this issue with my kids, or my marriage, or anxiety, and so I need to talk to somebody about it, because there is no way that you could know all this stuff. It just like there's no way that you can learn everything that a doctor knows, right? Or a car mechanic, right? So as far as you see somebody that you think needs additional help, well, there's a couple of things, and I don't know the whole context here, but one of the things that I find people do a lot is they will come to somebody for help. And so what I encourage people to do is a couple of things. Don't give advice. Okay. And actually, one of the things that I tell people is that therapy is not about giving advice. Right? It's about empowering people to make good decisions. And I always say, if I'm doing my job, I make myself obsolete. So there's 3 things that are required in order for somebody to change. Insight, which I call the seed for change, which is about understanding, why am I doing what I'm doing? Where is that coming from? How is it not serving me, and what would serve me better? So like we talked about triggers, for example. Perfect example. Why did I respond so intensely to, just, being ignored in that one moment? Where is that coming from? Right? And what would serve me well in terms of coping with that? So that's insight. The second is problem solving. And so problem solving is like, okay, I've identified this feeling, I'm feeling ignored. Where is that coming from? Right? That's the first step. what's in my control to change it. And then the third is coping skills. And so what I encourage people to do is, I mean, that's basically what I do. I teach people, I give them insight into why they're doing what they're doing, problem solving, and then coping skills. So I don't give advice. I ask a lot of questions. This is, where Columbo comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if somebody is coming to you for advice, let's say they're complaining. Oh, my husband, he did this and da 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 da. And if you repeated yourself several times, or if you said to that person, why don't you go talk to somebody about this? Instead, say to them, well, how did that make you feel when that person said that or did that, whatever they're complaining about, right? Or what do you want to do about that, right? Because what you're getting them to do is you're getting them to solve their own problems.
Mm-hmm.
Because the reality is that's human nature. People don't know why they behave the way they behave, first of all. And so you can't do the thinking for them. That's why most of the time when you give somebody advice, they don't follow it.
Right.
I always say, if information and reason was enough to change people's minds, nobody would ever speed on the highway or eat junk food. Because we know, right? We know that those things are not good for us, and we know why they're not good, and it's perfectly reasonable, right? But we do it anyway, because that's just human nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have to understand the why. And so by asking questions, what you're doing is you're helping that person to understand, what do I feel about that? Oh, you feel frustrated. Okay. So what do you want to do about that? So what you're getting that person to do is, first of all, identify what they're feeling, and then you're getting them to problem solve. Mm-hmm. What's in my control? What do you want to do about that? The other thing you can also do is say to them, I would love to help you, but I'm not a trained professional.
Yeah.
Right?
Set that boundary.
Yeah. And so, so by doing those things, what you're doing is you're redirecting them, right, to turn to somebody that, that you got it. They've got to help them. It's basically facilitating getting them
Mm-hmm.
to do what it is you want to do. And I always treat people the way I want them to behave, not necessarily the way they do behave.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I'll give people the benefit of the doubt. It's like, we were talking earlier about, somebody's acting a certain way, rather than focusing on the behavior, focusing on the feeling, or focusing on finding something that you can agree on. Like, for example, with couples, one of my principles is about working together as a team. So let's say, a couple is disagreeing about parenting skills, and they're going back and forth about this. So what I'll do is I'll say, okay, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? What's the underlying concern here or problem? Because what happens is too often what people do is they go right to problem solving, mm-hmm. right to finding solutions, instead of looking at what's the underlying concern. Because we can usually agree on that. You both want your kids to do well in school, right? You both want your kids to learn or to not get into trouble, get into behavioral problems, whatever, right? You can agree on that. And so what you're doing is you are finding a way to align instead of getting into a power struggle. Mm-hmm. And once you identify what that underlying goal is, then you can start problem solving. Okay, how can we achieve that? How can we help that child? And then you can start problem solving and brainstorming. So, what you want to do at all costs is avoid a power struggle. So anytime you try to talk somebody into something, that's what you're going to do. You're going to end up in a power struggle. So you can focus on, well, what is it that you're trying to accomplish? What is it that's bothering you, or what is the underlying issue here? Whatever it is. I mean, if they're being self-destructive, they're engaging in substance abuse, or maybe they're getting into repeatedly self-destructive relationships, or they're doing something that is outwardly destructive, hurting other people, whatever it is. That is, I say, people have good reasons for making bad decisions. And so what you want to do is you want to get to the underlying motivation. There is a feeling. There's no such thing as a wrong or a bad feeling. It's how people cope with it that's the problem. And so helping them to get to what is the method, what is the underlying issue. There's the method to the madness. What's the madness, right? Behind the method, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it was a great question. Thank you for asking that, and thanks for your answer.
I hope I answered it. If not, you can say so, and I'll maybe clarify, ask maybe a little bit more about what you're looking for.
Yeah. Are there any communication exercises that you think everyone in a romantic partnership could benefit from doing more, or any specific resources or books or tools that you recommend?
Right. So yeah, there are a lot of little like exercises. If you ever do couples counseling, oftentimes the therapist will give homework. So one of them, for example, is learning empathic listening and iMessaging. And so if you think about iMessaging as a formula, what we might encourage people to do is sit down, and again, you have to do this deliberately at a time when you have some time, you're not feeling under any kind of pressure. What I'll have couples do is I'll have each of them write down 1, 2, maybe 3 at the most, concerns, things that are bothering them, and putting them into an iMessage form. So, saying, when you leave the dishes in the sink, right, I feel taken for granted, right? Because, I think, well, I'll leave them in the sink, and I know that, I know she'll do them, right? She'll do them, right? So, and then you can say, and the way that I cope with that is by doing them anyway. But then, I harbor all this resentment, and I build it up, and then it comes out, I bottle it up, and then it comes out all at once, right? And so you can do like an iMessage exchange where you take turns, and one person, does something like that, whereas when you do X, I feel Y, and I deal with that, or I cope with that by doing Z, right? And then what the other person is supposed to do is they're supposed to practice empathic listening or active listening. They don't respond by saying, well, I would do them if you would just give me a little more time. Right. Okay? No. Right? I take turns. Somebody has to go first. And so, what you want to do is you want to show that you understand. And so you say, okay, so let me make sure I understand you here. When I leave dishes in the sink, you feel like I am, I'm just leaving them for you, and I'm figuring that, I'll just leave them, and I'm doing it deliberately because I know you'll do them. Is that right? And so what you want to do is you want to make sure that you're on the same page, that the person that is doing the listening has regurgitated back, reflected back exactly what the person who did the sharing, right, meant. And so what you want to do, and then that person goes, no, that's not exactly what I meant, and they elaborate on it, and you do that until the person that shared the iMessage feels heard. Right? It's like, okay, now I feel like you hear where I'm coming from.
Yeah, I know.
Right?
Now I know you get it. Yeah.
You get it. Exactly. And then the other person can respond. Right? And then you switch. You take turns, and then the other person does that.
Yeah.
So that's an exercise that you can do.
Yeah. And that's one, I mean, I think it's really important, like the bouncing back and forth between, it's not to prove a point. I think that that's something that I see fairly frequently whenever someone's talking about, they come into the Discord, or they're in on Twitter or whatever, and they're talking about, well, I tried this exercise and it just wound up being a blame game. And it's like, you're not trying to win. You're not trying to prove a point. You're trying to listen and understand each other. And that can be a hard thing. That can be a hard thing to overcome and realize. Because you do want to win.
Because there's a lot of feeling. And, again, there's, I mentioned I have these 15 principles, and some of them, touch on some of those other things. But let me say this. One thing that's helpful is to ask yourself, how would I word this, or how would I respond to this in a way that I am trying to increase my understanding of the other person, right? If your goal is to try to understand as opposed to win the argument or get the other person to see where I'm coming from, right? Because that's what communication is really for. It's about teaching and understanding so that you can problem solve.
Absolutely.
So that you can move forward.
Absolutely.
That's why we communicate.
Yeah. Is there ever a time where better communication just won't cut it? How do you determine if a relationship is not worth saving or too far gone for some reason?
Well, this is what I would always say, right? Before you get to that point, you should go and see a professional, right?
Absolutely.
This is not stuff that you're going to be able to do on your own if it gets to that point, right? Where, you're really considering, breaking up. And again, it's what I always tell people, it's a win-win, because you're either going to find out that it was miscommunication and your relationship's going to improve, or you're going to find out, okay, I've learned all these skills, I'm using these skills, and the other person isn't able to adapt.
Yeah.
And in that case, you're better off knowing that, so that you don't stay in a relationship. There's a relationship you want, and there's the relationship you have, right? And you want to make sure that you are not confusing the two. Because oftentimes that's what we do, is we try to turn the relationship we have into the one that we want. And that person may not be capable of doing that. And there's 3 things that you want to look for in a relationship. The first one is this meeting my needs? And there, what I'm talking about is, having similar priorities, similar life goals, similar, interests. The second one is, how am I being treated? Do I feel like this person has my back? They care about me. They're supportive of me. They feel like basically, they treat me well. And then the third one is flexibility. Is that person capable of adapting? If you've got somebody who says, well, this is just the way that I am, you know, and I'm not, nothing I can do about that. Yeah, that's a problem.
Right.
Right. That is, that's uh, rigidity, right? Personality rigidity. So one of my expressions is we don't have a crystal ball, but what we can have is a toolbox to take with us wherever we go in life, right? And that usually applies mostly to like anxiety, because people they worry and they anticipate, right? As a way of trying to control their anxiety. And so what I teach people is, you can't anticipate every outcome. You can't control every variable. You do what's in your control. But what happens is people don't trust themselves. They're afraid of messing up, and then that increases their anxiety. And so that's where perfectionism comes in, right? Or worrying, anticipating. But rather than doing that, what you want to do is you want to understand, identify the feeling, because your feelings are there as a survival mechanism. Just like touching a hot stove, you feel pain in your hand. Why? Because if you didn't, you wouldn't remove your hand and you'd burn your hand. If you don't eat for days, you experience hunger. Why? Because if you didn't, you would starve yourself to death. So we have feelings for the same reason. They're a survival mechanism to tell us that there's a need that we're ignoring, or a threat that we're ignoring. And so this is where the toolbox comes in, right? The more tools we have in our toolbox, right, the more in control we are, the less anxious we're going to feel, because we're prepared to handle any situation, no matter what comes our way. And so I forgot where I was going with that. Do you remember what we were talking about? We're talking about
well, we've got the
relationships.
Yeah, so relationships, and when they're not necessarily worth saving or not healthy, and communication won't save it. And we're talking about crystal ball, and yes.
So I bring that up because there are people who have only a set number of tools in their toolbox. You got a hammer and a wrench and a screwdriver, and it doesn't matter what it is, they're going to go back to those same tools, right? And so those are the kind of people that are extremely rigid, and they've adapted that way. They've learned to be that way. That's how they've gotten through life. And so it takes a lot of therapy to get that person to change, and they have to be willing to do that. And so that's where you run into a problem. And I would say, it's about 80 to 20% of the time. So 20% of the time, you might run into somebody who has that kind of rigidity, where they've got just a set number of tools in their toolbox. And so that's when they will have a difficult time adapting.
Yeah. And I mean, if you've gone to therapy and it just isn't working out, there's no sense. I mean, listen, I was married, I'm divorced, and my kids just asked me the other day, do you ever go on dates? I'm like, yeah, nobody's been worth continuing with. And that's one of the things that I learned from a relationship where there was not very good communication. And it's like, now I have a higher standard for it, because I know I have found my worth and I have all of these things. But if it's not something that is going to work out, if you've been to therapy and it's just not going to work out, you are better to move on than to stay in something that is unhealthy and unhappy. Don't stay together for the kids, etc. All the things,
Right. And particularly women are prone to that. I remember I had a patient that she'd been married, 12, 14 years, something along those lines. And she had come to the point where she was ready to divorce. And she had a 9-year-old daughter. And one of the things that she finally talked to her daughter about this decision, and her daughter was relieved. Here she was concerned about, tearing the family apart. But kids, they don't want to be in a situation where there's that kind of, I don't know, hostility, animosity, or just, whatever it is. And in fact, I grew up in that situation. I had a father who was verbally, physically abusive, and I wish that my mother had sent him away.
Right.
And I would have been much happier.
Yeah. And even if it's not, a situation where those kids are witnessing abuse or anything like that, just the simple question to ask, and it's not simple, but it's a simple question. It's not a very simple answer. But that is to ask yourself if you're in a relationship that you want your kids to be in one day. Because that's what they're learning.
I like that.
They're learning that whatever relationship you're modeling is the right way. And so if it's not the right way and you're staying in it for the kids, what lesson are you teaching them?
Right. Well, there's the be your own best friend thing comes in.
Yeah. Right? Yes.
And like absolutely. I said, I like to use my patients' kids against them.
Yeah. Hey, use them.
Yeah. Your daughter came to you, right? So again, insight. One of the things that happens with women, there's two things that I kept coming up with women. One of them is going back to this patient I was telling you about. So she came to me one day after we had been talking about this, and she was, prepared to walk away. And she was, I was thinking about this, and I've put up with it for 12 years. I can keep putting up with it. And I said, yeah, you could, right? But just because you can doesn't mean you should.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so what I say, particularly to women, I say women are capable of putting up with a lot, but that doesn't mean you should.
Yeah.
But the problem is because they tell themselves that they should, right? I should, if I can do this, I should do it, right? Otherwise, I'm being selfish, right? And then the second one is basically, this is what I hear from women. It comes down to this. If I set boundaries or assert myself, it's going to, quote, make things worse. And I say, yeah, you're right. It might very well make things worse, but that's because the other person can't handle you setting boundaries and asserting yourself.
Right.
Right?
That's a them problem.
That's a them problem. Right. And again, if all else fails, it's opposite of the golden rule, right? If the situation reversed and somebody came to me and said, I want to set boundaries, I want to assert myself, would you be like, oh yeah, no, I understand. I'm supportive of that, right? I call it don't look for permission because you're probably not going to get it.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, I think women are like, okay, I'm going to set boundaries. I'm going to assert myself as long as that's okay with all of you.
Is that okay with you? Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because no one's going to say.
Don't look for understanding.
Right. No one in their right mind is going to say, yeah, I want you to set a boundary because they've been taking, and this could be in all kinds of different ways. Right. I'm not trying to be, whatever, but they have been taking advantage of you. Well, right. They have been taking advantage of you not having boundaries, whether it's intentional or not. They have benefited from you not having boundaries. So no one is going to say, hey, would you please set this boundary today?
Exactly. Right. And if they were capable of doing that, they'd be doing it already.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So Bite Mark has a question that she sends in every week, and that is, what is your favorite poem?
Oh, you know what? I have a great poem, and I think I got it right here. So this is actually a therapy poem.
Okay.
And it's called Autobiography in 5 Chapters. Okay. Chapter 1. I walk down the street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I fall in. I am lost. I am helpless. But there's nothing I can do about it. It takes forever to find a way out. Chapter 2. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I pretend I don't see it. I fall in again. I can't believe I am in the same place, but I can do about it. It still takes a long time to get out. Chapter 3. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I see it is there. I still fall in. It's a habit, but my eyes are open. I know where I am. I do have some control over this. I get out immediately. Chapter 4. I walk down the same street. There is a deep hole in the sidewalk. I walk around it. Chapter 5. I walk down another street.
I
love that. It still gives me chills. So what that is basically the process of counseling, the process of therapy, the process of change. It starts out, we're like, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not even aware of it, right? And then it's, okay, I'm aware of it. I catch myself after the fact. Oh, I did it again. Then you catch yourself while you're doing it. Then you catch yourself when you're about to do it. And then you stop doing it.
That's awesome.
That's Yep.
Yeah, I like that one.
It really is a poem.
Yeah.
Written by I don't know, a therapist, I think.
That's great.
It's a real oldie but goodie.
Yeah. She says, I assumed I had missed the poem question because I was late. I'm so glad I didn't. I always try to make sure to ask it when you're here. And if you're not here, then I ask it usually towards the end anyway, just because I'm like, I know she's going to want to know.
I'm glad I had that one. I don't know what I would have said otherwise.
It's perfect. She said, I love it. Absolutely. Well, it is time for the magic moment of the stream. And I have, if I can get it to turn on, I have a magic wand here. It actually glows and lights up.
No, you have one too?
Wait, is that the same wand? Hold on. Oh, no, it's not. No, I was like, hold on.
No. Yes.
This one.
Wait a minute.
I love it. I love it so much. Okay, well, I'm going to wave my wand.
And no, I did not get this from my daughter.
Oh, Tyrion wants this one.
I'll tell you why I use it.
Oh, I was just going to say, I'm going to wave mine and you can wave yours. But if you could wave a magic wand and eliminate one common opinion or misconception or theory surrounding mental illness, disabilities, or mental health, what would it be?
Ooh, I'm glad that you asked me that question. So it is really the principle behind why I started my podcast and blog. Mm-hmm. And that is, I want people to understand that mental health does not just apply to like these psychiatric disorders, this compartmentalized sort of thing that we, attribute to like depression or eating disorder or substance abuse, right? It applies to everyday functioning, the kind of concepts that I've shared with you tonight, and that we need as a society to include mental health expertise into mainstream conversation, including what's going on in society right now. Remember, I talked about people have good reasons for making bad decisions. And whether you like it or not, again, as a social worker, I'm a pragmatist. If we don't identify the underlying reasons why people are doing what they're doing, we're not going to be able to change it. And so it's just practical. It's just pragmatic. So much of what we're seeing are emotions in search of solutions. They're just bad solutions. They're destructive solutions. Sometimes people turn that destructiveness inwardly. Sometimes it's outwardly destructive. And so, it's about understanding that mental health doesn't just apply to our relationships, our personal relationships, or our own inner, psyche, but also work situations, but also society as a whole.
Yeah.
But the reason I have my magic wand, and don't tell people because it's cheating, right? But this is what I do is if I'm trying to get somebody to consider something that they wouldn't allow themselves to consider. Like for example, let's say we're talking about a person's childhood. I'll say, okay, I'm going to wave my magic wand and you're going to go back in time and you're going to talk to the younger you. What would you say to her? What does she need to hear that she's not hearing, right? Or if you could do anything you want with your life, right? I'm waving my magic wand. What would that be? Because we have a tendency to talk ourselves out of things.
Right.
But the whole idea behind it is to get to the underlying insight, the underlying feelings. So that's why I use my magic wand when I need to.
Yeah, I love that. That's great. Well, that kind of brings us to the end here. So I am going to post your socials one more time. If anyone wants to connect with Elaine, please feel free to click on any of these. This has Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the podcast, a link to the blog, a link to the YouTube, all of that. Feel free to click on any of those. And Elaine, I'll just open this up to you for a little bit, as much time as you need to talk about anything we didn't cover, or resources, or anything like that you want to throw out there.
Let's see. So I guess let's see, because we were supposed to be talking about communication, right? And so one of the others that I guess would be useful to just cover is what I call honoring the past while staying in the present. So I'll give you a simple example. So if I was working with a couple and I was recommending date night, and the reason that we do this is because, a lot of times, especially when you've been, in a relationship with somebody for a long time, there's so many different things that get involved in that relationship, chores and errands and kids and work and finances and stuff like that. And so what we do is we create date night where, the couple can just be together, focused in the present moment, enjoying each other's company without focusing on anything that's going to happen, anything that has happened, anything that's going on in their lives. So I was talking to, this couple about this, and the wife says, I've tried that. He never wants to do it. And I said, okay, I get it, right? But you're here now, and I assume you're here because you're open to doing things differently, right? And so even though he said no in the past, right, we're going to keep an open mind that, that you're both here because you're willing to change. However, having said that, I also appreciate the fact that you have some, you feel discouraged. You feel disappointed. You have, maybe some trust issues because of past experiences. And we have to honor that as well. So it's about balancing those two things. Where it really falls into a really good example is when there's infidelity. If somebody says, okay, you're here because I assume that you want to give the relationship a chance, you're open to moving forward. At the same time, we have to also respect the fact that your trust has been undermined. And that's where the triggering comes in again, because some person says, okay, I'm going to be meeting my buddies at the bar. It's like, okay, I get it. I hear what you're saying, but I also have to be transparent with you that when I hear you say that, there's a part of me that, I'm experiencing a lot of anxiety over that. And we need to work through that. We need to figure out a solution to that. And so, that's a really important one. If you're ever going to do any kind of work, is both of those things are valid.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I appreciate you coming on and joining us to talk about all of this today. I think that this has been a wonderful conversation. So thank you for just being here with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, Mom. And it's really been fun talking to you too.
Absolutely. I hope you found as much value in our conversation as I did. A big thank you to our incredible guest for sharing her wisdom and insights on communication, mental health, and relationships. Remember, it's all about embracing the messy parts of life and finding strength within those moments. If you're looking to connect with Elaine and explore more of her expertise, be sure to check out the links in the episode description or head over to tacosfallapart.com. Remember, you're not alone in this journey, and seeking support and resources can make all the difference. As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, I encourage you to subscribe, rate, and or leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback means the world to me personally, and it helps the podcast reach even more people who could benefit from these conversations. And don't forget to follow me on social media. You can find me as MommaFoxFire on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, LinkedIn, all over the place. Wherever I can be, I am there as MommaFoxFire. Stay connected, join the conversation, and continue to be a part of our vibrant community. Before we go, I want to leave you with a reminder: your mental health matters. It's as simple as that. So embrace the complexities of your experiences and know that even when things fall apart, you're still loved and you're still valued and you are still valuable. Keep sharing your stories, reaching out for support, and exploring the journey of self-discovery. Thank you for tuning in to Even Tacos Fall Apart. Until next time, remember that you're never alone, and we are here cheering you on every step of the way. Stay strong, stay compassionate, and keep loving yourself and others.